In this short lecture, we're going to look at some of the things to include when drawing a graph. This lecture is based on one of the chapters from the ebook Get Better Grades in College. This ebook can be downloaded from the website address on the slide, from where you can also download some of the chapters for free. This is an example of the kind of graph we're going to talk about, an XY graph. As you can see from the legend, it's a graph showing the fall in a student's attention level over time during a lecture, a phenomenon you are probably well familiar with. We're going to look at 6 components that it's important to include in any such graph. We're going to say a few words about each of these components: the size of the graph on the page, the graph title, axes labels, units, scales, and legend. Let's start with graph size. Put simply, make sure your graph is large enough for the details to be seen. A small postage stamp sized graph may be a good way to save paper, but it's just difficult to see. Have the graph take up at least half the page. If there's a lot of detail in the graph, you may have to make it even larger. Second, every graph should have a clear title. You can put the title over the top of the graph or at the start of the legend, as in this example. We'll talk more about legends in a moment. A simple way to title a graph is to use a modification of the axis labels, as in this graph, where the title is Graph of Student Attention Over Time during a 45-minute lecture. Next we come to labeling the axes. Make sure you identify what the values on each axis are. Don't leave the reader to guess what's been graphed. In this graph, the y-axis label is student attention and the x-axis label is time. Next we come to something that people often leave out: the units of the values on each axis. In this graph, the units of time plotted on the x-axis are minutes, and this is included in brackets after the axis label. If the units were not included here, someone looking at the graph would not know if the lecture lasted 50 minutes or 50 hours, or if student attention dropped 20% over 10 seconds or 10 minutes. So please, don't forget to include the units. Next we come to marking axis scales. Label the quantities on both axes. In the graph on the slide, you can see the y-axis scale is labeled from 0 to 120% in increments of 20, and the x-axis is labeled from 0 to 50 minutes in increments of 10. How many increments should you include? Well, too many clutters up your graph with unnecessary detail. Too few makes the graph more difficult to interpret. I would suggest at the very least that you mark the lowest and highest values. How many other values you put in between is a matter of judgment. In general though, if there are values that are theoretically important, you should include those also. As an example of this, a graph I use when teaching physiology is that of the changes in pressure in one of the chambers of the heart during a heartbeat on the y-axis against time on the x-axis. The highest pressure reached during a heartbeat is 120 millimeters of mercury, and the lowest pressure is 0. So I would mark these two values at the top and bottom of the y-axis. The value 80 millimeters of mercury is a point at which the pressure gradient between the heart and the major blood vessel leaving the heart reverses direction during a heartbeat. Therefore, as 80 millimeters of mercury is a theoretically important value, I would also mark this on the y. Finally, include a legend. The legend is the explanatory text below the graph. The main purpose of the legend is to briefly describe the graph. There is, I'm afraid, no correct answer to how long or short the legend should be. There is always a compromise between the need to include enough information and the need to keep it brief enough to fit under the graph. The best guide is that it should have enough information to allow the person looking at the graph to interpret it without having to return to the text of the article to work out what's going on. So there you have 6 things to include when drawing a graph. You can find more suggestions for improving your grades in the ebook Get Better Grades in College, Written by an experienced college lecturer who has marked and graded thousands of items of student coursework and exams. The ebook can be purchased and downloaded at this website, from where you can also download some of the chapters for free.